Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to move into our last section of material and focus on angiosperms and specifically on angiosperm reproduction. And so you've seen this slide before when we talked about seed plants, and I show this here to illustrate a couple of things. One is one of the main synapomorphies, and we'll go through these in a second, for angiosperms, which is the flower. And while there is a huge array, as we can see on this slide, of reproductive morphologies, so different floral morphologies for across angiosperms, ranging from that rafflesia, that big 3-foot diameter flower that attracts flies for pollination, to things that maybe we're more familiar with, like the trillium, which is just coming into flower right now in our flora, or the passion flower. And you can see that in all of these examples, there's a huge amount of variation, but there's actually a core set of parts that really unite these more than 300,000 species together. And those parts all really revolve around reproduction. And so this last section of the class is going to focus on angiosperm reproduction and getting at some of the details of the morphology and development through the reproductive and ecology of the reproductive process in angiosperms. And so the first place I want to start with that is looking at the synapomorphies for angiosperms. And so here's the phylogeny that we're familiar with. We've seen this ranging from the green algal ancestors through our evolution of land plants and all of the traits that we've talked about through this section of the course. And I've circled here the 5 synapomorphies for angiosperms. And you'll notice that 4 of these are reproductive, and are synapomorphies, shared derived characters in the reproductive system. One of those being the evolution of the flower, and specifically the evolution of the carpel and stamens, and we'll talk about what those are. Evolution of endosperm, which is a storage tissue that we find in the seeds of angiosperms. And so we'll talk about that and the origin of that. Some details of the structure of the female reproductive parts, in having bitegmic ovules, and that's an ovule with 2 integuments around it. We'll talk about that. And then the 4th reproductive one is having an overall reduced female gametophyte. And so this female gametophyte is now reduced to the point of having no archegonia, as we've mentioned before. And so the archegonia are gone, and we have this ultimately reduced female gametophyte. And then there's one synapomorphy for angiosperms that is not reproductive, and that's having vessels in the xylem. So we've already gone through that character of that division of labor between the tracheids and vessel elements in the xylem of angiosperms. So that's a synapomorphy for all of our flowering plants. One I won't go into here, but we will go into the details of these 4 reproductive synapomorphies in angiosperms. Okay, so since most of these are revolving around the flower, the first part that I would like to focus on today is the flower parts themselves, and making sure that we are all able to recognize the major flower parts. If we were in lab, we would have a lab that's focused on this, but in lieu of that, I'm going to go through some slides here and try and point out some of the different flower parts that we have, and recognizing those flower parts in sort of your standard flower. And so here is an Arabidopsis flower that shows that reproductive axis. And so the flower itself is really a compressed reproductive shoot. And so I'll show you this a little bit later, but you can imagine this as being a branch, basically, with different parts that are all some form of modified leaf or modified branch that is modified into these reproductive structures. And I'll go through each of these parts, these different modifications of a vegetative shoot that then are compressed down into the flower here. And so we have the pedicel of the flower, which is this short stalk, the non fertile parts of this. So these are the vegetative parts of the flower. The pedicel, that stalk that holds the flower up. The sepals, which are oftentimes green and not showy and are around the outside of the flower. The petals, which are often showy to attract pollinators. And then the main reproductive parts, the fertile parts of the flower, are the stamens, which are the male reproductive parts, and the carpels, which are the female reproductive parts. So those stamens and carpels are really our synapomorphies when we talk about the flower itself. And so this flower really, when we talk about it, we talk about these 4 different whorls of the flower. A whorl is just where all the parts are attached at the same point. Remember whorled leaves when we talked about leaf arrangement? All those flower parts attached at the same point make up the 4 whorls of the flower. The outer whorl being the sepals, and the next one in the petals. These are our vegetative whorls. Or sterile whorls of the flower. And then the stamens and carpels make up the male and female parts. And these are the fertile reproductive whorls. And so these 4 whorls of the flower these 4 whorls make up this compressed axis that's the reproductive part of a plant that the part of an angiosperm, a flowering plant that we call a flower. And so here is sort of a generalized figure of that flower, and we'll go ahead and we'll label all the parts of this flower, starting from those outer whorls and working our way toward the inner whorl. And so just like we saw on that flower that I showed you, we have the reproductive stalk, or the modified stem that leads to the flower. We call that the pedicel of the flower. We have then all the point of attachment of all of the 4 floral whorls, and that's the receptacle. This is the end of the stem where on which the flower or those four whorls are attached. We then have the outermost whorl of flower parts, and these are the sepals. So this is an individual sepal. This whole whorl together, a lot of these are going to have collective terms that go along with it. All of the sepals together we call the calyx. The calyx, while it is often green, it is not, and functions as sort of protection of that flower bud. So this outermost whorl, these are going to be the protection while this is in bud. When this flower opens up, they're then on the outside of the flower. So the main role of the sepal is to protect. There's some small photosynthetic role to the sepals as well, but that main role is to protect. Now, I will say that these sepals are not always green. Sometimes the sepals are showy, and in that case, the function is to attract pollinators. So sepals don't always have to be green. They most often are, but sometimes we'll have actually petals that are absent, and the sepals themselves are the showy parts of the flower. But in general, the calyx, or all the sepals together, are not showy and are typically green. Okay, the next whorl in is the second whorl of parts in are the petals. And the petals are, of course, most often showy and and the function is to attract pollinators. So they, together, these also have a collective term, and the collective term for all of the petals together is called the corolla. So the corolla's most common function, as I said, is to attract pollinators. However, depending on how plants are pollinated, if these are wind pollinated, these will often be missing. Those are be gone completely in a wind pollinated plant because we don't need to attract a pollinator in a wind pollinated plant. And so there are modifications to these that might make it so the petals would be absent or not be showy to attract pollinators. And as I already mentioned, sometimes the sepals will be showy and attract those pollinators in lieu of showy petals or along with showy petals. Together, these two vegetative whorls, or these two sterile whorls of the flower, also have a collective term. And so together, we call the corolla and the calyx together the perianth. And we'll use that to describe, we'll use the perianth to describe all of these non-fertile parts of the flower as one whole piece. Okay, the next two whorls of the flower are our two reproductive whorls, or our two fertile whorls of the flower. And those are the male reproductive parts and the female reproductive parts. So the next whorl in are the male reproductive parts, and we call these the stamen. And the stamens are made up of two pieces. Those two pieces to the stamen are the stalk that holds the stalk that holds these up, that's the filament. And what the stalk is holding up is the anther. And so the anther is this oftentimes yellow piece to the stamen, which inside of it is the pollen grains. So the pollen grains are inside. So these are really the sporangia, where the male gametophytes are formed. And we'll go through the reproductive life cycle and go through all of the pieces of this, but the pollen grains are going to be inside of the anther. So the anther and the filament together make up the stamen, which is the male reproductive parts. All of the stamens together make up that whole male reproductive whorl, and this is called the andrecium. In Greek, ecium means house, andro means male, and so this is the male house. All of the stamens together make up the andrecium. Okay, on the female side, the female reproductive whorl are made up of the carpels, or I'll say carpel or carpels. There is a collective term for all of the carpels together. So all carpels, like with the female, this is derived from Greek, gyno for female and ecium for house. So the gynecium is the female reproductive whorl, all of those parts together. In a typical flower, which I've laid out here, that the carpels are usually broken down into three different parts. The stigma, this is the sticky part at the end where pollen is actually received. And so this is our pollen receptive part of the female reproductive organ. The style is the long, narrow piece of the carpel. And then the last piece is this enlarged portion, typically at the base, which is called the ovary. And inside of the ovary are ovules. And so the ovule, I'll do the singular, ovule is contained inside the ovary. And the ovule is made up of an egg with its surrounding integuments, these protective layers. And I will go into detail and show you the integuments. We talked about these really briefly when we talked about land plant evolution, but I'll come back to this and show you this in a little bit more detail, since it is part of our synapomorphies for angiosperms. So the female reproductive parts, the gynecium, is made up of carpels. Those carpels are typically broken down into these three parts: the stigma, style, and ovary. And inside of the ovary, we have ovules. The ovules themselves are an egg cell and surrounded by integuments, or these protective layers. So that's our generalized reproductive morphology of the flower. So let's make sure that we can recognize this in a real flower. And so I went out and I took some pictures of a flower that's big and has some parts to it. This is a Hypericum, or a St. John's wort flower. This is an ornamental one, so bigger than our normal St. John's wort. And we can take a look at this species and try and see if we can label these same parts on here as we did on our generalized diagram of that flower. And so we first got the stalk. Remember that flower, the stalk, that modified stem that leads to the flower. That's called the pedicel. And then we have the point of attachment of all of our reproductive whorls. So the spot on the end of that stem where all of the flower parts are attached, and that was called the receptacle. And then we move into our non-fertile, or our stale floral whorls. The green ones on the outside here are called the sepals. So that's a sepal. All of those together would be the calyx. And then the showy yellow ones here that are mostly for pollinator attraction, are the petals. And so here's a single petal. Altogether, the petals are called the corolla. Okay, so there's those non-fertile reproductive parts. And then just so you have these all written out, I've gone ahead and put our definitions for the flower parts and talked about including those collective terms like calyx, the collective term for the sepals of one flower, or the corolla, the collective term for the petals of one flower, or the perianth, the collective term for both the calyx and the petals together. I've added one additional one on here, which are the tepals. And so when the perianth part, the sepals and the petals are not differentiated from each other, when the sepals and the petals are both very similar, like you see in a tulip, we call these tepals. And so that's just a little bit of a different term when the sepals and petals are not differentiated morphologically from each other. We can still see that the sepals on a tulip are the outermost whorl, and then we have another whorl of 3 petals. But because those are not morphologically different, in this case we call them tepals. And then the other one that I've shown, a picture I've thrown in here, is of a ribes. This is a currant. And what we see here in ribes is actually the sepal is this bigger, more showy part than the petal, which is the smaller pink tooth in the inside here. And so here we actually have showy sepals in this currant rather than having green sepals. But still, based on the position, I can see the outermost whorls are sepals, and then we have our petals, and then the fertile reproductive whorls on the inside there. And so I've also put the function for sepals. Function is to protect and bud, but sometimes they'll be more colorful and showy than the petals, and they'll attract pollinators too. Where with the petals, these are often colorful and showy and function to attract pollinators. And we'll talk more about pollination and biology in another lecture. Okay, so now let's see if we can see the reproductive part. And so if we flip that flower over and we look at this, we can actually see the reproductive whorls as well. And so in this flower, we've got the first reproductive whorl is the male reproductive whorl, or remember what we called that was the andrecium. So all of those stamens together was called the andrecium. I've diagrammed out boxes here for one stamen, and so we'll label this as a stamen. And remember that all of the stamens equals the andrecium. We can break one stamen down into the filament and the anther. And so while the main pollinator attracting organ in this is the petal, the big yellow showy petals, you'll notice that the filaments here are also yellow. And because there's so many of them, they're probably involved in some pollinator attraction as well in this particular flower. Okay, the other part we can see here is the female reproductive whorl. The female reproductive whorl, remember, consists of the carpels. And in this case, we have 5 fused carpels. And together, I'm going to call all of these the gynecium. It would be the general term for all of my carpels together. And if you remember, and so what you can see here is that there are actually 5 separate styles, and each of those with 5 separate stigmas on the top of them that all unite into this one ovary. And so in this case, we say that this flower is what we call a compound flower that consists of 5 fused carpels. So we have one ovary, but I have 5 styles, and I have 5 stigmas. And so that actually gives me an indication that the gynecium of this flower consists of 5 carpels that are fused together, because I have these external morphology, these 5 separate styles with their 5 separate stigmas, is an indication that these are 5 things that were fused, 5 carpels that were fused together. So I'm using this general term gynecium, but I also want to introduce a different term here, which is the pistil. And so a pistil is not always equivalent to gynecium. When it's a compound pistil, it is. And I know that this is where things get a little confusing, and so I'm going to go ahead. I will explain this on another slide, but I want to make sure that I just introduce that term pistil to you here. But pistil and gynecium are not always interchangeable. When they're compound, when the gynecium is compound, meaning the carpels are fused together, then it is interchangeable. When they're not, then it's not an interchangeable term. So gynecium is more general, but pistil is what I could use to refer to this stigma, style, and ovary of this compound pistil. So that's why I've introduced that term in here right now. Okay, so when we actually look, I don't have a diagram of the inside of this particular gynecium or this pistil, but I want to go ahead and open up a different one here and show you kind of what the inside, what's inside of the gynecium or inside of this reproductive whorl. And what we have here are inside of these are the ovules. And so if you remember from that other diagram, the ovule is the egg-containing the ovule is the egg-containing gametophyte. So I'm going to define this as the egg-containing female gametophyte. And really, the better way is the ovule contains the egg. So actually, I'm going to start this over. Let's erase that. Sorry. I think there's a better way to define this. I'm going to call the ovule is the egg and surrounding integuments. The integuments are these protective layers that surround the egg, and together those make up the ovule. And then the better way to say this is that this contains the female gametophyte. And the reason that's the better way to say that is that actually parts of these, the integument itself is actually comes from sporophyte tissue. And so it's not fair to call the ovule the female gametophyte. The female gametophyte is inside of the ovule. And so it's important. The majority of the structure inside the ovule is the female gametophyte, but this does contain some sporophyte tissue as well. So the ovule is the egg and the surrounding integuments. And it is basically an immature seed. So before a seed gets fertilized, before the egg is fertilized, we call it an ovule. After fertilization occurs, then we call this a seed. So the ovule is an immature seed. The other thing that we can see in here is everything that the tissue that each of these ovules is attached to, and that tissue is called the placenta. So the placentae are tissues that are lining the ovary that bear the ovules. So placenta is the tissue that lines the ovary and bears the ovules. And just like a placenta in in mammalian systems that we're used to hearing that word associated with, the placenta actually provides nutrition for the developing from the sporophyte to that developing female gametophyte. So it has a nutritive function, just like we see in other systems for that placenta. So that's what we see inside of the ovary. When we look inside the ovary, we find the ovules attached to placentae inside there. Remember, the ovule contains the egg. Okay. So I realized that, so again, I put these definitions out here so I have the stamens consisting of their filament and their anther, and this provides the male function in reproduction. I've got that collective term andrecium on there, and then I have the carpel as the ovule producing structure. It consists of a swollen ovary at the base and elongate style that supports the stigma at the tip. And this is where pollen is deposited and germinates. And then, as we'll see, the style is the structure where the pollen travels down to the ovules. And the carpel itself will provide the female function to the flower. Now, here's where it gets confusing. So flowers can have a single carpel, or they can have many carpels. So that example that I showed you up here, we had 5 carpels in this particular flower, in this gynecium. This example here, we have 2 carpels in this gynecium. Again, there's external morphology in that there's 2 styles here with 2 stigmatic surfaces, 2 stigmas. Those came from those 2 separate carpels that were fused together into this one pistil, this one gynecium. Okay, so flowers can either have a single carpel or many carpels, and those carpels may be separate from each other or fused together. And so what pistil is pistil is a generalized term for each individual female structure in that flower. When it's a single pistil, or we have multiple separate pistils, we call this a simple pistil. And when they're fused together, where one pistil might be consist of many carpels that are fused together, and that's a compound pistil. So here I had a compound pistil made up of 5 fused carpels. Here I have a compound pistil made up of 2 fused carpels. But I might have just a simple pistil made up of 1 carpel and have 1 of those in there. A bean is a good example of this. Bean flowers have 1 simple pistil. Or I might have many separate simple pistils that are not fused together, and then each one of those is a separate simple pistil made up of 1 carpel each. Okay, and then together I call these all the gynoecium when these are all together. I'm just scrolling through here to see. I realize now that I have failed to put in a good picture. Oh, I have one. I'll scroll back to. Okay, so let's continue this discussion of pistils and carpels, and then we'll kind of try and clarify that here. Okay, so what is this deal with carpels versus a pistil? And so here I have a diagram that shows 1 simple pistil made up of 1 carpel. And so when I take a cross section of that simple pistil, I see 1 placenta where the ovules are attached in that one ovary, making this 1 simple pistil. So here, this is a simple pistil. So the gynoecium is made up of 1 simple pistil, made up of 1 carpel here. And I can tell that because I have 1 placenta, or 1 point of attachment of the ovules. So the ovules all attach at 1 point here along this 1 placenta. And that's 1 simple pistil. Now, when I have a compound pistil, like in this example here, means that this pistil is made up of 2 or more carpels that were fused together. In this case, if I take a cross section here and look at it, I see there are actually 3 separate points of attachment, or 3 placentae, where those ovules are attached. You can also see that this ovary is divided into 3 chambers, or 3 locules, 3 chambers. We also call those locules, or 3 locules. That's another indication that this is 3 carpels that were fused together into 1 compound pistil. If I look at the external morphology, I also see that there are 3 stigmas, 3 styles with 3 separate stigmas. That is another indication that this is a compound pistil made up of 3 carpels. So the external morphology helps with this. And so we might see that these styles and stigmas are separate, like I just showed you. Or we see that maybe the style is united together and instead I have 3 stigma lobes. And that's another indication that this came from 3 carpels that were fused together into this 1 compound pistil. So I'm not always going to have external morphology. Sometimes these stigma lobes might fuse together into 1 capitate stigma. And so there's no external indication. In that case, I need to do a cross-section of the ovary, look inside and see how many placentae there are, or potentially how many chambers are inside. If there are 2 chambers inside there, maybe this came from 2 fused carpels, or 3 chambers, or 5 chambers. So we have to look inside at those points of attachment. And so pistil and carpel are interchangeable when we're talking about 1 simple pistil. But when the carpels are fused together into a compound pistil, then the carpels and pistils are not an interchangeable term. But we can use gynecium to describe all of the carpels, whether they're separate from each other or fused together. So I have this example here where we see these compound pistil that's made up of 5 fused carpels. I've got 1 ovary, but I have these 5 separate styles, and so that's my external morphology that helps me recognize this. So what about when we have a simple pistil? So I mentioned the bean example to you, and the bean is a good example of one simple pistil. That's one carpel. When you open up a bean, think about where those seeds are attached. They're attached along one place, right? One line. That's the one placenta where those bean seeds that were the ovules are attached inside from that one simple pistil that makes up a bean. But in some plants, we actually have simple pistils, but we'll have many simple pistils that are all separate from each other. This tulip tree is a good example of that. This is Liriodendron in the magnolia family. And what we're actually seeing here is we see the petals arranged around the outside. You can't see the sepals, they're underneath here. But there's our petals, and then we see our many stamens arranged. That's our andrecium, or our male whorl. And then on the inside, we actually have the gynecium, or the female whorl. And that gynecium, in this case, is made up of many simple pistils. And so each one of these are not very distinct in this picture. There are a bunch of them spirally arranged, and each one is a little line with a little brown stigma on the top of it. And so we've got a little line with a little brown stigma on the top of them. We have a lot of these all spirally arranged on this axis here. But each one of these is one simple pistil. All together, they make up the gynecium of this flower. I realize that's not the best picture. I'll get a couple more pictures for you next time to show you, just to emphasize this point of the simple versus the simple pistil versus the compound pistil. Let me scroll back down to where we were here. Okay, so that's the deal with carpels and pistils. So I'll get you a couple more pictures and we'll re-emphasize this point. I want to end this just talking about when we have all of these flower parts together or separate, and go through a few more terms that we can use to describe some of these flowers. And so here's a bit more on flowers. We call a flower complete when all 4 whorls are present. So that means we have sepals, we have petals, we have stamens, and we have a gynecium, some pistil or carpels, all in the same flower. That's a complete flower. So an incomplete flower is one or more of those whorls missing. And so I've already mentioned to you that if in a wind-pollinated plant, there's no point in having petals. So we might have an incomplete flower where those petals are gone. And so here in the bottom right here, actually, these are flowers, male flowers on the top, female flowers on the bottom, from a willow tree. Willows are wind pollinated, and you see that there are no showy petals, or no sepals and no showy petals. So the flowers are actually much reduced down to just those reproductive parts. In the case of the male flowers, just the andrecium, just those stamens. In the case of the female flowers, just this pistil. It's a compound pistil made up of a couple of carpels, but we have just the pistil is all that is left. There's no petals. So these are incomplete flowers. We can also describe whether the plant is hermaphroditic or not. And we call hermaphroditic flowers perfect. So these are both reproductive, both sexes are present. So both reproductive whorls are present. Or I guess both fertile, I should say. Fertile whorls are present. So both stamens and pistils. So we have both our andrecium and gynecium. So this is our, like the flowers we just saw, this is our are hermaphroditic flower that has both stamens and pistils, so both stamens and carpels. An imperfect flower is unisexual. And so one reproductive whorl missing. And so in the case of these flowers down here, those those willow flowers, these are our male flowers. So they only have male reproductive parts, no female reproductive parts. And these are our female flowers. And so these only have female reproductive parts and no male reproductive parts. Because these are missing some of the whorls, like our petals and sepals in this case, as well as one of the reproductive whorls. These are all incomplete. But because they're also unisexual and are either male or female, they're also imperfect. So these are imperfect and incomplete. Here's one on the left-hand side that actually shows a bit of a showy flower that's also unisexual. And so here we have a female flower. And here we have a male flower. The female flower just has its showy part. So here's this, it looks like just petals. And then we've got this gynoecium. This looks like a compound pistil with its ovary and then the style, stigmas and styles here. So this is an imperfect and incomplete female flower. And then here's an imperfect and incomplete male flower with just its stamens. So just the andrecium. When things are imperfect, when flowers are imperfect, they can be arranged either on separate plants, or we could have unisexual flowers arranged on the same plant. And so in this situation, we call these either monoecious or dioecious. So monoecious are imperfect flowers. Where we have separate male and female flowers on the same individual. So if you remember that ecious is for house, mono is one house is the way that I remember this. So we've unisexual flowers, but they both occur on the same plant. So we've got male flowers on one part of the plant, female flowers on another part of the plant, but they're on the same individual. So this is a monoecious plant. A good example of a monoecious plant are like birch trees. These have separate male and female flowers, but they're found on the same individuals. Or alder trees. These are another good example of imperfect flowers that are on the same plant, that same individual. And this is contrasting with dioecious, where these are imperfect as well. So separate male and female flowers. But these have separate male and female individuals. And so this is two houses where we have separate male plants and separate female plants. So willows are a good example of this. Your willow will either have all male flowers on it, it's a male individual, and then a separate plant, a separate individual will have all female flowers on it. These are what we refer to as dioecious. And of course, you can't ever have this be cut and dry in plants or in biology in general. And so we have polygamous systems, and these are just various forms of mixed systems. Maples are a good example of this, where in some maples you have hermaphroditic flowers, and then on the same individual we'll have male flowers, so male imperfect flowers on the same individual. Or you might have a separate situation where it's all female flowers on one individual and hermaphroditic flowers on another individual, or male flowers on one individual and hermaphroditic flowers on other individuals. And so you can have mixed systems where it's not strict monoecious and dioecious. Instead, you have things like androdioecious, or gynodioecious, where we have separate individuals that do a little bit different things. But the point here is that we can have mixed systems involved in this as well. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and stop this video here. I'll start the next one with a little bit of I'll go over that pistil carpal stuff, and I'll try and find a couple pictures of some multiple simple pistils that are easier to see than that tulip tree that I showed you. Okay, thanks, and we'll see you next time.